Before I welcome our keynote speaker, Dr. Khari Brown, to the stage, all of you all, or a number of you all, are here for different professors and their classes. Make sure that you sign the sign-in sheet that your professor asked for, okay? So if you're in Dr. Beeman's class, she wants that sheet at the end of the night, okay? If you're in Dr. Hill's class, we're gonna make sure she gets it. If you're in my class, you better sign the sign-in sheet, okay? But I know you're here, Donald, and there'll be others that are here too. At least I can say I saw you, all right? But your professors want that sheet. Also, you can get food also throughout the evening. Feel free to do so, and you can bring the food in here. All right, that being said, I have the honor and privilege of introducing our keynote speaker for this evening, Dr. R. Khari Brown. He is a sociology professor at Wayne State University, college where my grandfather went to school back in Detroit, Michigan, where he teaches classes and does research on the sociology of religion. In 2021, the University of Michigan published his book, Race and the Power of Sermons on American Politics. I was a reviewer for that one. This book examines the impact of race on the relationship between religion, social justice attitudes, and political activism in the United States. His new book project, which is also published by the University of Michigan, examines how race and faith impact congregational involvement in grassroots social justice activism. Dr. Brown is the co-investigator of a major survey called the National Politics Study. It's a biannual study that assesses American political attitudes, behaviors, and religious life. He's also the editor of a major sociology journal called Sociological Focus. He regularly consults for the Pew Research Center, which is a huge think tank. He is also a community organizer, and he does faith-based research organizing firms with faith-based research organizing firms in the Detroit area. Hey, y'all, with no further ado, let's welcome Dr. Khari Brown to the stage, y'all.
Okay. Hello. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Shelton, for those kind words. And thank you for your staff for coordinating this event. And thank you all for attending and listening to me share my thoughts on race, religion, and politics from Richard Jackson to Khari Brown. On February 4th, 1965, Richard Jackson, my father-in-law, who is, as you can tell, African-American, and from Marion, Alabama, was 19. Here he is in this picture with his brothers and his father. On that day, he, along with his brother Jesse, their fellow church members, and other area blacks, participated in the peaceful protest march for the right to vote. They began their march from Zion Methodist Church in Marion, and they walked towards the Perry County Circuit Clerk, which stood only about 2 blocks away. But before they arrived, local police sent them in every direction except the courthouse as they chased protesters and beat them with their clubs. Now, fortunately, my father-in-law, he was too quick. He got away. He escaped unharmed. But his brother, Jesse, he wasn't so lucky. The police caught him and beat him at least one time before he could get away. So whenever my father-in-law and Jesse talk about this story, Jesse usually asks him, "Why didn't you come back and help me?" To which my father-in-law would say, "Why'd you let him catch you? You should have been faster than that." That's a running joke between them. But in all seriousness, Mr. Jackson and the other protesters weren't completely shocked by the police's brutality. Prior to that march, they'd attended a series of church meetings with their pastor and along with the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, as well as with Southern Christian Leadership Conference organizers, they clearly explained to them the risk. They explained that the risk being arrested, beaten up, and maybe even killed. Understanding these risks, Mr. Jackson told me that he and others were willing to die for their beliefs. Well, a few weeks later, on February 18th, at another voting rights demonstration in Marion, Alabama, Jimmy Lee Jackson, who's not related to my father-in-law, but Jimmy Lee Jackson, a 26-year-old Vietnam veteran and a deacon at his church, he did die for his beliefs. At that demonstration, James Fowler, an Alabama state trooper, shot and killed Jimmy Lee as he attempted to defend his mother from police officers that were beating her. Following Reverend King eulogizing Jimmy Lee, he and SCLC leaders organized the Selma to Montgomery Voting Rights March. As I'm sure most of you know, this march's aim was to draw public attention to the state's repression of African Americans and to push Alabama State Governor Wallace to support a voting rights bill that protected the constitutional rights of African Americans to vote. Like the Marion March, the Selma March began violently. On March 7th, 1965, euphemistically known as Bloody Sunday, the Alabama Highway Patrol beat the marchers as they attempted to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge to begin the first stage of their march. Under the protection of the National Guard, the march ended on March 25th, 1965, at the steps of the Alabama Capitol building, with Governor Wallace refusing to meet with the demonstrators or to even consider their demands for a voting rights bill. Nonetheless, 6 months later, on August 6th, President Johnson signed into law the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which federally protected the rights of all citizens to vote. Now, by nearly every metric I can think of, Black life in our nation has significantly improved in the decades following Mr. Jackson risking his life for the right to vote and of President Johnson signing the Voting Rights Act. In southern states like Alabama and here in Texas, Black voter turnout during presidential elections increased from roughly 43% in 1964 to roughly 66% in 2012, when Barack Obama, our first president of African descent, was elected for a second term. As a whole, 2/3 of Blacks voted during the 2020 presidential election. Over time, growing Black voter turnout rates, along with the greater willingness of whites to support Black candidates, contributed to Black congressional representation increasing more than eightfold between 1963, 2 years prior to the Voting Rights Act, to the beginning of Obama's second term in 2013. And as you can see on this chart, in 1963, African Americans were less than 1% of Congress. By 2013, they were nearly 8.5% of Congress. And today, African Americans are 11% of Congress. The greater ability of Blacks in Congress, along with the increased willingness of Congress as a whole to enforce the civil rights reforms of the mid-20th century, this effort undoubtedly contributed to Blacks having more opportunities to live fulfilling lives in the decades following the civil rights movement of the mid-20th century. So for example, in 1965, less than 1% of managerial and professional jobs were occupied by African Americans, less than 1%. Today, 1 in 10 managers are African Americans, and my wife, Khari Brown, and Richard Jackson's daughter, is a data point. So She's the director of clinical affairs at the University of Michigan Hospital System, which is a major academic hospital system. And her primary job is to ensure that the hospital system is profitable. That's all I can tell you about what she does. She makes the University of Michigan money, and apparently she's pretty good at it. So these occupational gains predictably led to higher incomes for African Americans like my family. Between the mid-'60s to 2021, Black net income increased by 14%, the largest income gain of all race groups. At the same time, the Black poverty rate was cut in half, going from 40% in 1965 to 17% in 2021. These and other socioeconomic improvements very likely contributed to Blacks living healthier and longer lives. As this chart indicates, between 1975, which is the year before I was born, and 2020, Black life expectancy increased from 61 years to 74 years, while narrowing the white-Black gap while narrowing the white-Black life expectancy gap from 8 years to 4 years. In short, life is better for African Americans today than when Mr. Jackson was a young man. And the vast majority of Americans, roughly 80%, according to this 2014 CBS poll, recognize this to be the case. And about the same proportion, if you look at that blue bar, believe that we as a nation are better because of changes brought on by the civil rights movement. It's great, right? Yes, it is. It's great. It's wonderful. So then, how are we to understand that African Americans are consistently more likely than others to believe that more needs to be done to improve their racial group's well-being? In a 2022 AP NORC poll, roughly 4 in 10 whites believe that most of the goals of the civil rights movement have been achieved, while less than half of African Americans share the same sentiment. This same poll, the other side, finds that Blacks are considerably more likely than whites to believe that a lot more needs to be done in this nation to improve Blacks' access to a quality education, good jobs, affordable housing, affordable health care, and other socioeconomic resources so that Blacks may receive equal treatment in this nation. All over this nation, the sentiment that our country has not quite met the goals of the civil rights movement is reflected in the work of faith-based grassroots social movement organizations like Moses of Detroit, who models itself after the civil rights organizations in which Mr. Jackson, my father-in-law, was active. And Moses stands for, as you can see, Metropolitan Organizing Strategies Enabling Strength. Moses and other faith-based social justice firms like it are interested in increasing the political power of the working class and poor, of which African Americans are overrepresented. These groups are also interested in linking the concerns of those in the socioeconomic margins, particularly the Black working class and poor, to those living in more affluent communities and the state of Michigan as a whole. In doing so, these groups meet in religious congregations and increasingly over Zoom to identify community leaders and issues that community members care about. They also train leaders in lobbying techniques to push local and statewide elected officials to sponsor and co-sponsor legislation aimed at improving access to affordable health care, increasing funding for public schools and job training, ending police brutality, and all other legislation aimed at improving the quality of life of the poor and working class. Now, I got so wrapped up in teaching about Moses and studying Moses that I joined. I went down with a delegation of Moses activists on May 24th, 2023, to Lansing, our state capital. And I went down there with them to meet with state legislators to discuss how we could build public support for a single-payer healthcare bill that 23 of our legislators were sponsoring or co-sponsoring, including my own legislator, Felicia Brabeck. I was there. You can't see me because I took the picture, but I was there. I went down there. Single-payer healthcare is an issue that Moses cares about because in the US and in Michigan, and I'm sure it's the case here in Texas, the percentage of income that people are paying for their healthcare has been steadily going up. And this has been the case even with the passage of the 2010 Affordable Care Act, which increased the percentage of Americans that have health insurance, which is a wonderful thing. But despite the 2010 ACA, healthcare costs have steadily gone up as a percentage of an individual's household income. And unsurprisingly, these increased healthcare costs are felt most heavily by the poor, again, of whom African Americans are overrepresented. So while across the country, an average family is going to pay about 4% of their income on healthcare, premiums and deductibles. Families whose incomes are less than 200% from the poverty line, they're paying over 10% of their income on healthcare costs. And just as a point of reference, if you're paying more than 5% of your income on healthcare, that means you're underinsured. That means you're having to make sacrifices for housing, clothing, transportation, food, when you are paying premiums or deductibles. So, the fight for single-payer health care in Michigan, I went with a Moses delegation to our state capitol. And I took my daughter, Kira, Richard Jackson's granddaughter, with me. Now she said, oh yeah, I want to go because I'm concerned about the rising cost of healthcare for poor people, especially in Detroit, that has the disproportionate share of African Americans. I'm like, okay, right, you want a day off from school, which is fine, it's fine. It's fine. She got a day off from school, I got somebody to go with me to Lansing, it was cool. So she went with me, and my dad, in the upper left corner here, he also went with us as well. My dad's a political scientist at Wayne State. At any rate, across this nation, there are roughly 200 faith-based community organizing firms like Moses. And roughly 30% of clergy say they've had some involvement with these types of groups. But again, the question we're left with is, why do African Americans and those that stand in solidarity with them, the working class and the poor, want more from this nation? And why are organizations like Moses mobilizing Americans to demand more? Well, in a word, I'd say it's equality. We humans, all humans, want to be treated equally so we're able to attain what we want and need. So the issue is that despite the amazing progress we've made on race in this nation since my father-in-law was a young man, race inequities continue to persist in nearly all qualities of life, from incarceration to poverty and wealth, to health outcomes, to nearly all other quality of life metrics you can think of. Also, despite the fact that we're much less racially segregated than we were 60 years ago, it's still the case that roughly half of Americans live within racially segregated communities. And by this I mean roughly half of Americans would have to move from their current neighborhood to another neighborhood in their metropolitan area to ensure that each neighborhood in that metropolitan area had the racial representation of the region as a whole. So for example, where I live, where I work, Detroit, 74% of people in the metropolitan Detroit area would have to move from their neighborhood to another neighborhood to ensure that each neighborhood had about 15 to 16% African American, 2 to 3% Hispanic, 3% Asian, about 70% white. You get the idea. That's what would have to happen in Metro Detroit. Here in Fort Worth, Dallas area, about 56% of people in this region would have to pick up, relocate to another neighborhood to make sure that each neighborhood has the racial representation of the metropolitan region as a whole. Now this is not inconsequential. This is very meaningful because due to blacks being poorer, the concentration and isolation of blacks in certain towns or certain parts of towns leads to their communities having disproportionate rates of concentrated poverty. It also means that their communities have a disproportionate amount of poverty-related social problems, like having higher rates of unemployment, higher rates of unemployment, lower performing schools, higher rates of street crime, and all other poverty-related social ills. So, again, one reason why African Americans and those that stand in solidarity with them and advocacy organizations like Moses continue to demand more from this nation is that while race is not nearly as large a determining factor in one's life chances as it once was, it still plays a role. Now, one challenge that groups like Moses face in moving this nation towards racial equality is racial inequality itself. As I'm sure you can imagine, the fact that Moses disproportionately mobilizes the race group with the least amount of wealth and subsequently donates the least amount to political campaigns mean that it's no walk in the park for Moses to schedule meetings with elected officials, let alone influence how they legislate. And this is no dig to Debbie Dingell, my congresswoman. She's phenomenal. But in general, Moses, this is a challenge for them and groups like them. The racially segregated nature of the neighborhoods in which these groups organize also does them no favors when trying to convince the public and the legislators that issues like affordable health care, criminal justice reform, access to clean and affordable water, and other issues that disproportionately affects poor blacks are not just poor black issues, but these are issues that concerns and impacts everyone. Now, I'm going to use the affordable water issue as an example of the challenges that these groups face in pushing legislators to act on their policy demands. Between May and October of 2018, the Detroit Water and Sewage Department shut off the water of 11,422 Detroit residents. In response, an interracial group of religious leaders of Muslim, Jewish, and Christian faiths gathered at Hart Plaza in downtown Detroit to demand that the city stop shutting off residents' water. In explaining the importance of water to public health, Reverend Kenita Harris, pastor at Detroit Bible Tabernacle, told a reporter at another water rights rally 4 years later the following: people cannot drink, they cannot cook, they cannot flush toilets or maintain sanitation. The lack of water threatens the lives of people and disrupts community health and well-being. The increased rates of water shutoffs since 2013, with more than 140,000 persons having their water turned off between 2013 and 2020, is grounded in race and place. As Detroit city government attempted to shore up its finances following its 2013 bankruptcy, it began more aggressively targeting for payment residents who were delinquent in their water bills. Now, the city's bankruptcy itself followed decades of white middle-class residents and businesses fleeing the city. This demographic shift had the net effect of Detroit becoming increasingly black and poor as its tax base declined. By 1990, Detroit had become the largest city with the greatest concentration of African Americans, and subsequently the poorest large city. Today, it remains among the top 3 large cities with these characteristics. These demographic shifts of Detroit going from a city with a critical mass of wealthy whites and large industries, along with middle class and working class whites, shifting from that to a city that was predominantly African American and increasingly working class and poor, it led to city officials increasingly going into debt to maintain city services, such as maintaining the city's water infrastructure. That said, the clergy attending the 2018 rally, the 2022 rally, and all subsequent water rallies made both moral and pragmatic arguments when disagreeing with the city's approach of balancing its budget by cutting off vital services like water. At the 2018 rally, Reverend Stephen Bland, senior pastor at Liberty Temple Baptist Church in Detroit, stated, "It is inhumane and sacrilegious to build a great city on the backs of its impoverished people and then deny them basic human rights like food and water." To stem the tide of water shutoffs, religious leaders like Reverend Bland and Reverend Harris called on the city to create a water affordability plan that linked water rates to household income. In the months and years following these rallies, these organizers continued lobbying city and statewide officials to support their water affordability plan. On October 3rd, 2023, their efforts bore fruit when Michigan State Senator Stephanie Chang of Detroit introduced a series of bills to the Michigan Senate that mandates that for consumers earning up to 200% of the poverty line, water rates cannot exceed more than 3% of their income, which is a standard set by the Environmental Protection Agency. However, since introducing these bills, they have sat idly in the Housing and Human Service Senate Committee awaiting a vote. So they haven't even been voted on the floor of the state Senate or House. This is where we stand, even though 3/4 of Southeast Michiganders, including Detroit, support this policy of water affordability. And I'm talking about Southeast Michigan because 6 out of the 7 Democrats serving on the committee where these water affordability bills are housed represent districts within Southeast Michigan, and yet it's not coming up for a vote. In addition, nearly everyone that attended the legislative hearings on water in the House and in the Senate supported these bills. But 99% of people who attended the House hearing on water affordability expressed public support for the package of water affordability bills. 94% of individuals that attended the Senate hearing expressed support for these bills. Finally, the vast majority of Southeast Michiganders support Moses and Michigan Welfare Rights, 2 of the main faith-based organizations advocating for affordable water. Now, I've already talked about Moses, so now I'm going to share with you some of the amazing organizing work of Michigan Welfare Rights in their attempt to make water affordable in Detroit and throughout the state of Michigan. So, Michigan Welfare Rights is housed within Central United Methodist Church. And it's led by Maureen Taylor, Sylvia Donio, and Marion Kramer. And basically, I mean, the Michigan Welfare Rights is a ministry of Central United Methodist Church, and the individuals leading Michigan Welfare Rights and the water affordability movement are members of Central. Grounded in liberation theology, Michigan Welfare Rights and Central believe that God has a preferential option for the poor. This means that they believe they are doing God's work when they are advocating with and on behalf of the working class and poor. Maureen Taylor's explanation for what motivates her to continue the struggle for water rights is made quite well in an interview that she conducted with a Unitarian Universalist Service Committee member. During the interview, she stated, "This is a spiritual fight to me. I can't imagine what kind of person, what kind of community, what kind of legislature, what kind of government, what kind of country would go to that length," which is shutting off people's water, "to punish people because they are poor." In an effort to push Detroit and Michigan to pass water affordability legislation, since 2003, Michigan Welfare Rights and their allies have sued Detroit and Michigan. They've engaged in civil disobedience, leading to arrest. They've testified before Congress, the US Congress, and the Michigan State Legislature. They've held press conferences. They've lobbied local and statewide officials. They even submitted a report to the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the human right to safe drinking water and sanitation, where they documented water shutoffs in Detroit. In response to the report, the UN Special Rapporteur traveled to Detroit. They did their own investigation, and in the report, they stated that by shutting off the water of people who cannot afford to pay for it, the city of Detroit is engaging in human rights violations. The UN also ruled that the UN Special Rapporteur also agreed with the policy recommendations of Michigan Welfare Rights in tying water rates to household income. Let me just briefly share an action that illustrates the lengths Michigan Welfare Rights has gone and is willing to go to ensure that all Detroiters and all working class and poor people have access to clean and affordable water. During the summer of 2018, Michigan Welfare Rights, the Poor People's Campaign, and affiliated religious congregations like Central participated in a summer of disobedience aimed at pushing Detroit to impose a moratorium on water shutoffs and to implement the water affordability plan. As part of this campaign, on June 18, 2018, hundreds of demonstrators congregated in front of the Detroit Water and Sewage Department before walking to the CompuWare building, which is here on the left. I don't know if you can see it, but it's a large green building. This is all happening in downtown Detroit. So they marched from the Detroit Water and Sewage Department. They marched a few blocks down the street to block the entrance of the CompuWare building. And while they're blocking the entrance of the CompuWare building, they also block traffic by standing in front of the Q Line railway car, which is the red railway car in this picture to my left. Marion Kramer stated that she and others put their bodies in front of the railway car to bring attention to the city's immorality in subsidizing a railway car to bring young professionals, many of whom are white, to work and from home to work into entertainment, while neglecting the tens of thousands of low income and mostly black Detroiters who need water. For their civil disobedience, the police arrested 23 activists, including Marion Kramer, as you can see in the middle picture. And they arrested Reverend Rowe, pastor emeritus of Central United Methodist Church. Now, when asked why he and others were willing to get arrested, Reverend Rowe stated, "Nobody's paying attention. We're seeing a crucifixion of the poor." Nonetheless, despite popular support for water affordability and popular support for the Michigan Welfare Rights Movement, the water affordability bill is still in committee and it still has not been up for a vote. The main reason this is the case, as far as I can tell, has very little to do with Michigan Welfare Rights organizing tactics or their ability to generate public support for their campaign. And it has a lot more to do with the fact that clergy and activists affiliated with Michigan Welfare Rights and their allies are advocating with and on behalf of people who lack political power. The Detroit residents who are behind on their water bills or had their water shut off don't regularly vote in local and statewide elections. And they certainly don't contribute thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars to political campaigns. In fact, if you look at the zip codes, they had the highest rates of water shutoffs, or the highest rates of individuals that are behind in their water bills. It also correlates with zip codes that donate the least amount of money to political campaigns, which, as we know, or should know, is what candidates and elected officials listen to. So even though Michigan Welfare Rights led a contingent of activists to the House and Senate hearings on water to express their support, the legislators that are sitting on that committee and the legislators that are outside the committee but that have an opportunity, that would potentially have an opportunity to vote on that bill, are very likely calculating that if I go the other direction of Michigan Welfare Rights, I'm not going to suffer. Because it's very unlikely that they will have the financial resources to put money behind a candidate that will unseat me for my not supporting this bill. Now, in contrast, representatives from the property owner and business associations, they attended these hearings as well, but they expressed opposition to these bills. So, while they represent a very small percent of those attending the hearings, these organizations, the property owners and the business associations that oppose the bill, they have pretty strong political action committees that put money behind both Democratic and Republican candidates across the state. A lack of political power is an important reason why the single-payer health care bill that I mentioned earlier, which Moses is advocating, is also stuck in committee. Both of these bills have been stuck in committee for almost a year now. Now, this is the case even though nearly 2/3 of Americans and close to 90% of Democrats, according to a 2022 Pew Research poll, support single-payer healthcare bill. And in my state, the state House, the state Senate, and the governor's mansion are all occupied by Democrats, and yet that bill has also been languishing in committee. One possible reason that I think is that Blue Care Network health insurance, the Blue Care Network health insurance is the largest health insurer in the state, and they have one of the most powerful political action committees in the state of Michigan. They're opposed to this bill. And they're opposed to it because it would drastically reduce its market share if they were forced to compete with the state of Michigan as an insurer. As a consequence, the single-payer healthcare bill, like the water affordability bills, are sitting in committee awaiting a vote. The relative lack of political power that groups like Moses, Michigan Welfare Rights possess also, for me, helps explain why, when speaking at a Detroit high school on Labor Day, Vice President Harris did not mention affordable water or single-payer health insurance as policy strategies to ease the living cost for working class and poor Detroiters. Now, Trump, he didn't talk about water or healthcare either. He didn't talk about working class for the poor either. But my concern is, for the purpose of this talk, is with Harris. And my concern is with Harris because if African Americans in Detroit vote, they're going to vote for her. And they're going to vote for her because African Americans are the most loyal electoral voting base of the Democratic Party. 2016, 93% of African Americans in Detroit and the state of Michigan as a whole voted for Clinton in 2016. 2020, same percentage. Nonetheless, for Biden. Nonetheless, the cost of living issues that matter to many Detroiters, water and healthcare, did not receive a mention in Harris's Labor Day speech. So the point here is that even though Moses and Michigan Welfare Rights and their allies are advocating for proposals that are widely popular and would benefit the working class and poor, of whom African Americans are a disproportionate share, these groups lack the political power to push legislators to consistently act on their demands when they make them. Despite these challenges, Moses and Michigan Welfare Rights, at their core, are faith-based organizations. As such, their leaders and volunteers have faith in a higher power that their work is meaningful and that they are acting in accordance with what they believe is God's will when they are organizing, when they are organizing in their region, the state as a whole, and in the nation. And so even though they are organizing a group that has a limited amount of political power, when you look at the world in which Richard Jackson came of age and was active in Marion, Alabama, and you compare it to the world in which Khari Brown is coming of age and becoming politically conscious in Ann Arbor, Michigan, it does leave me hopeful. I'm hopeful that groups like Moses and Michigan Welfare Rights that are acting in the spirit of the civil rights movement will continue to empower African Americans and those that stand in solidarity with them to raise the consciousness of the public and political leaders to support policies that benefit everyone. Thank you. Thank you for listening. All right. Sorry. Sure. Yes. Okay, just got to turn it on, I guess. Yep.
Hey, everybody, we're almost done, okay? But can we put that last slide back up there of his daughter so she can get a little shine in the room for a little while?
Yeah.
Before we let Dr. Brown go, we do have a few minutes for a couple of questions. If I have one or two myself.
Go for it.
But I wanted to see if anybody had a question for Dr. Brown. You do? Okay, I'm going to let you go first, and then I'll ask mine.
Thank you very much. So my question is, was there any sign that the city of Detroit knew the impact they were going to have with these mass water shutoffs, or was it more of a kind of last-ditch effort that they didn't think too much about?
I would say that if you take the perspective of the community organizers, Moses and Michigan Welfare Rights, their position is that the city of Detroit is interested in recruiting capital to the city. They're interested in recruiting young professionals to the city. They're interested in recruiting entertainment venues to the city, businesses to the city, so they can compete with other cities around the country. So they would argue that the city of Detroit's primary motivation is to recruit capital to the city, even if it means that working class and poor folks are going to be hurt. Now, from the city perspective, they would say that this is just pragmatism. They have to balance their budget. You know, if you have a city that's bankrupt, then you can't provide basic city services as well. So it's a difference of opinion. It's a difference of a position based upon where you stand. So if you're community organizing, your concern is first and foremost with people on the socioeconomic margins first. If you were in the mayor's office or you're in city council, yes, you are thinking about the people on the socioeconomic margins, but you're also thinking about what you can do to improve the quality of life by attracting capital to the city, increasing the city's tax base so that you do have money to subsidize people that cannot afford water. But it's really a difference of perspectives, and when I've talked to them, that's what they say. that's what they tell me. Yeah.
Anybody else? Another question before I ask mine? Yes, I'm coming right now.
So earlier you stated that there was like a report filed over to the UN about the water situation.
Yeah.
What was the response to that? Like, I would imagine like something that's like as crucial as like water, like it's
Yeah.
a proven
Right.
like human
Right.
need. But I also know like countries like the U.S. like previously we also voted against if food is like a human right, we voted against that. So I'd imagine that water is pretty much on the same level. I haven't looked up water, but I know for sure for food, that's where we stand on stuff like
Right.
that.
Right.
So what was the response whenever the UN found that there's been a consistent issue with that, especially in
Yeah.
Detroit?
Well, I mean, the legislative response was no different. I mean, that report was in, that report was in 2018. The report was in 2018. So in 2023, State Representative Stephanie Chang introduced the Water Affordability Bill, which, as I stated, her policy proposal was to ensure that if you make up to 200% of the poverty line, then they can't charge you more than 3% of your income, which is what the UN had agreed with. But there was no movement in the state legislature. I mean, they were aware of this report as well. There was no movement in the legislature. So again, it's an issue of balancing priorities. And like, I really do think that it's just an issue of, of power. If you are in a position where you think that if I vote the wrong way on this bill, I may lose my next election. And I may not be able to move from the state Senate to perhaps Congress, then you're going to think twice. But if you think that there are not going to be very many consequences of this, of my actions, there'll be more consequences if I decide to pass this water affordability bill and upset the property owners and business associations. So that's the balancing act that they're making. And that's just a challenge. I mean, when you are organizing groups of people that don't have tons of money, and tons of money does correlate with political power, then it's a challenge. It's a challenge to force them to take your demands seriously when you make them. So the response was non-action. That was the response. Right.
Anybody else? A third question? I
Over
see
here.
you over there. Let me get her on that side.
So I recognize your mention of involvement in faith-based organizations concerning community involvement and community organization efforts. And I was wondering what differentiates faith-based community organization from secular? And on top of that, as an increasing amount of Democrats become religiously unaffiliated, do you foresee longevity in a faith-based approach, or would interfaith or secular movements become a bigger part of community organizing in the continuation of this movement?
That's a great question. So, first of all, when you look at trends of religious involvement in the U.S., they're going down. So, trends of worship attendance are going down. Trends of people who identify with a religious faith, they're going down. And they're going down among young people the fastest. That is what you see. So that's reality. And let me just back up just before I answer this specific question. These groups like Moses and Michigan Welfare Rights, the core leaders of them, they are religious folks. But they align themselves with many different groups, like the Sierra Club. They align themselves with the Sierra Club. They align themselves with neighborhood associations. They align themselves with universities, like Wayne State. I teach an internship course, and I have my students intern at Moses. So they're open to anyone that's interested in social justice, anyone that's interested in social, and that is a core tenet of liberation theology, which is what they believe, that you're not really religious unless you're active on behalf of the poor. I mean, their views of the gospel is one in such that it's not coincidental in the New Testament that Jesus was from an occupied group. It's not coincidental. It's not coincidental that when he was doing his miracles, it's to people that are sick and are hungry and are blind as a consequence of Roman occupation. That is their theological belief. So they are very open to working with anyone that is concerned about water, healthcare, schools, criminal justice reform. So that's the one. And if you follow them, you'll see who their allies are. It's very clear. Now, in terms of why faith-based organizations, like why focus on them, given these trends that we're seeing, which is very true. The issue is that if you look within these communities in Detroit, or even in Ann Arbor, where I live, which is more affluent, the groups that are tackling these issues, they are religious. That's just what it is. The groups that are tackling these issues, they are mainly, I'm not saying mainly, but many of the groups that are tackling these issues have a faith orientation. And part of the reason is, one, there's a group of people that you can mobilize. There's a group of people that are there on a fairly regular basis, even though there are fewer of them than there were a generation ago, and they're older than they were a generation ago. You still have a captive audience to organize people. And so Moses and groups like Michigan Welfare Rights are trying to be efficient with their time as well. Where can you go where there's a group of people that are at least willing to listen to issues that they care about? So you see them in congregations, and you also see them organizing through unions. And of course, unions have the same issue that religious congregations have. Membership is going down as well. But you have to organize, in many cases, you have to organize, the organizing strategy is to organize through organizations. So congregations, labor unions, that's the strategy. Yeah.
Dr. Brown, I want to add to your answer because I loved her question that
Sure.
much. So one of the things that you all don't know, unless you've taken my class, is that I do religion and politics too. So your question got me too.
Yeah.
So I would love to have a nerdy professor moment with you on this.
Sure.
So my answer to your question doesn't differ from his much, but I do think that the Democratic Party, I think, has an interesting question to ask. Most of the people that are leaving organized religion tend to be Democrats.
Sure.
They tend to, so
Sure.
it's like when
Sure.
you were watching the Democratic National Convention a few weeks ago, you don't see signs that say atheists for Kamala.
No.
But they're there,
Right.
And you don't see many of them at the Republican National
No.
Convention. They're there, so that taps into your question. Right. But what I also think is true at the same time, and I have a feeling we might agree on this, is that I think for African Americans in particular, and a lot of minorities, we're questioning a higher power, but that doesn't mean we're becoming atheists. Right. And so the data is pretty clear that for not all, but for most African Americans in particular, we can move away from Christianity, but we still tend to believe in a God. And so that's where I think is very complicated. And that just because people say that they're not a Christian or they're not a Muslim or they're not whatever the A is, doesn't mean that they don't believe in God. And I think that that's where it gets really interesting to figure out what role religion and politics will play in the future. And so that's where I think race and religion and politics have a really interesting relationship as we look forward to the future. That's all I would say.
Very true.
If you wanted to, I want to give you the last word on it though, sir.
No, I agree with you. I agree that's what's happening. I mean, you have these trends that are happening such that, and it's not just labor unions and religious congregations. I mean, Americans, we are just much less likely to be in any organization than we were a generation ago, a couple generations ago. But the question for groups, if they're faith-based or they do not have a faith orientation, is how do you reach people? How do you mobilize people? How do you organize people? And what types of arguments can you make to connect the concerns of people that are on the margins to people that are middle class or upper middle class? And so some of what they're trying to do is to make a case that, and it works for some people, particularly for African Americans, that if you believe in a higher power, if you believe that all people are created equal, then you should believe that everyone deserves access to water or access to decent health care. Now, again, these arguments are becoming more difficult to make because fewer people are religious. But when I think about their theology, it's really a universalist ethic that everyone is connected, that they are promoting, and that motivates their action. So, again, on the one hand, faith is important because it does motivate their action, but also that's how you reach people. That's where they are. Thank you.
So, Dr.
More questions?
Brown,
Yes, go ahead.
I know it's almost time to get up out
Yes,
of here.
yes, go for it, though.
But I want to ask one last question.
Yes.
And I want to turn this a little bit different.
Okay.
I want to stick with your theme, but turn it
Sure.
a slightly different direction.
Sure.
I love what you're talking about in Michigan and the local issues there on
Right.
the ground in Detroit and
Right.
in Lansing. I remember paying attention to
Yeah.
that a few years ago.
Yep.
So I want to turn it to DFW for a minute.
Okay.
And I'm going to still give you the last
Okay,
word.
sure. No, you got it.
Do you all, as college students at UT Arlington, know what happened today with voting in this university? Somebody tell me what happened today and how it affects you all in this city. I saw some heads shaking.
The MAC is now a place for you to vote.
Now a place where we can vote, right? So for folks who don't know, UT Arlington has been a place where you have been able to cast a vote in presidential elections and local elections for a long time. But as of today, or as of the last week, the idea that you all, me included, because I live in Arlington, cannot come here to cast a vote, was up for a vote today by the Tarrant County Commissioner's Office. And it was people in this room, like you all, college students. I played my part too and sent a few emails and made a few phone calls to say that this is important, that young people and local residents should be able to come to UT Arlington to cast a vote in the presidential election. Actually, Donald, you sitting over there. Donald was there today and spoke up at the Tarrant County Commissioner's Court. Y'all should clap it up for Donald. So, Dr. Brown, what I'd like for you to have the last word at, sir,
Sure.
is I'd like for you to tell these young people the importance of being college students and being actively engaged in their community.
Yeah.
This is a time in their life
Right.
where they have so much power that I don't think they really realize. And that came out here in a lot of ways.
True.
It's not so much about religion, but can you empower
Right.
these students in this room with the message of how
Well,
they can impact the world and move locally?
I mean, this is a great point, and I didn't mean to seem nihilistic in saying that, these groups don't have political power because they donate tons of money to political campaigns. Because one of the ways that these groups see activism, it's the long view. It's the long view. You don't know when a political opportunity will arise in which your issue would become salient for the masses of people, in which elected officials have to move on it. But if you're never active because you think it's not going to matter, then they'll never have to be responsive to your activism. So these groups, Moses and Michigan Welfare Rights, and local groups in the Fort Worth area, if you say that, well, in the Detroit example, why don't we just give up on this water issue? It's never going to happen. This bill is never going to move out of committee. Those legislators will never deal with it. Because there will come a time when it is politically expedient for them to deal with it, but they won't deal with it if you're not active. So I agree with Dr. Shelton on that you have a lot of power, and even though it may seem in the short term that you're not getting, that the elected officials are not listening to your demands, I would say do not give up. That's my last word.
Hey, y'all, let's clap it up for Dr. Brown.
Oh, wonderful.
We have a couple of small tokens of our appreciation for you, sir. Will you step over here real quick? So we got a plaque here for you, sir, to Dr. Khari Brown for our 13th annual opening lecture, sir.
Thank you.
Very good. Let's take this photo real quick. And of course, we gotta have a Center for African American Studies t-shirt, y'all. Gotta have that. Now, I don't know what size you wear. We'll figure that out. But here you go, sir. All right. Real quick, as we get out of here, there is extra food. So on your way out, you can go to the table and you can grab some food on your way out. And also on your way out, you've got these sheets here. There are some students in the blue shirt at the table on your way out. Thanks for coming. God bless. Good night.